The sheriff didn't look her in the eye as he shoved her onto the back of a mule, her bundled things tied in a sack slung over the saddle horn, the snow falling soft but steady as if to quiet the shame. Her belly had just begun to show, and with it came the judgment of the entire town, especially her father, who wore the badge and barked about honor louder than any man she knew. They said she'd shamed him, letting herself get ruined by someone too cowardly to claim her. She didn't speak as he rode beside her through the timberline trails, higher into the hills where wind bit harder and silence pressed thick. They passed the last marker post before the mountain wilderness swallowed the path, and still he didn't explain. Only when they reached a small clearing with smoke rising from a one-room cabin did he stop. A man emerged from the trees behind the cabin, tall and wrapped in furs, a rifle slung over one shoulder, eyes dark as riverstone beneath his fur-lined hat. He didn't speak, just studied her with a quiet gravity that unsettled and steadied her all at once. The sheriff handed over a folded letter and said, "She's yours now. You don't have to keep her long, just long enough for the gossip to die down." Then he turned and rode away, not once looking back. The man glanced at the letter but didn't open it. Instead, he reached out for the reins of her mule and nodded toward the cabin. She followed without a word, unsure whether she was walking into punishment or something far worse. The inside of the cabin was clean but sparse. Stacked firewood, a worn rug, 2 chairs, 1 bed, and a quilt folded with care. He gestured toward the hearth where a stew pot steamed gently, then pointed to a cot tucked behind a blanket curtain. She sat, still shaking, every sense on edge, expecting cruelty, expecting coldness. Instead, he laid a second quilt over her shoulders and placed a tin cup of warm tea in her hands, never speaking, never staring. He didn't ask her name. He didn't demand hers. That night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled low, she lay on the cot with the quilt pulled to her chin, watching the shape of him in the chair across the room. He didn't sleep. He just watched the fire, as if guarding it, or perhaps guarding her. And for the first time in weeks, she slept through the night. By morning, the wind had died down, and sunlight spilled through the gaps in the cabin's shutters, casting golden streaks across the floorboards. She sat up slowly, still wrapped in the quilt, half expecting the strange kindness of the night before to vanish with daylight. But the man was already outside, splitting wood in the snow, bare-handed beneath fingerless gloves, the steam from his breath curling like smoke in the crisp air. She watched him for a while, trying to read him the way she had learned to read men. Watch the hands, the jaw, the distance in their eyes. But this one stayed unreadable. When he returned, he gave her space again, placing fresh bread and butter on the table, nodding once, then settling into his corner, as if he were no more than a shadow. Still, she couldn't ignore the folded letter sitting untouched on the mantel. That letter, her father's words, likely full of venom, lies, and guilt-shifting excuses, had been in plain view since last night, yet the mountain man hadn't even glanced at it. Curiosity burned her, but she didn't dare ask. She lasted until noon before finally rising from her cot and walking barefoot across the floor to the mantel. She picked it up, heart hammering. He watched her, not stopping her, just quiet and still. She opened it. The ink was blotched and sloppy, as if written in anger. It said, "Keep her through winter. You'll be paid in spring. She's carrying shame, mine and hers. Don't ask questions. She doesn't need kindness, only cold to cure her rebellion." Her throat tightened. Her father hadn't even written her name, just bartered her like meat to a man he barely knew. Her knees went weak. She sat hard on the floor. The mountain man stood then, slowly, and for a moment she feared he might be angry she read it. But he walked over and knelt beside her, took the letter from her hand, tore it in half, then into quarters, then tossed the pieces into the fire. The flames swallowed the words like they'd never existed. Still kneeling, he reached out, not to grab her, not to comfort with boldness, but to gently touch the edge of the quilt still draped around her. Then he met her eyes. He still hadn't said a word, but in his gaze she saw something shatteringly clear. He didn't see her as payment. He didn't see her as punishment. Whatever her father thought he'd arranged, this man had his own code. And for reasons she couldn't yet understand, he'd chosen to follow it instead of obeying the terms of her exile. For the next 2 days, silence became their language. He moved through his routines with quiet precision, fetching water from the creek, tending traps, splitting firewood, always leaving enough warmth and food to make her feel human again. She helped where she could, sweeping the floor, mending a frayed coat sleeve, chopping herbs she found hanging in bundles from the rafters. She didn't know if he noticed, but somehow she hoped he did. On the 3rd morning, she dared to follow him outside. He looked back but didn't stop her, just handed her a second pair of mittens without a word. She walked beside him down the snowy path towards the trap line, the only sound their boots crunching over frost. When he knelt beside a snare to free a snowshoe hare, she studied the gentleness in his hands. The same hands that could split logs like kindling. And her voice came out before she meant it to. "My name's Clara." He paused, glancing up at her with something soft in his gaze, something grateful. Still silent, he nodded once, tucked the rabbit into his satchel, and stood. She half expected him to say his name in return, but he didn't. Not yet. Back at the cabin, she felt something in the air had shifted. She no longer felt like a burden, but not quite a guest either, more like a shadow melting into shape beside his. That night, while she stirred the stew and he polished a piece of carved antler, she asked quietly, "Why haven't you spoken?" He didn't look up, just slowly tapped his chest with 2 fingers, then pointed to his throat. Her breath caught. Was he mute? Wounded? She tried again, gently. "Were you born that way, or did someone do that to you?" He looked at her for a long moment, then simply shook his head. Neither then. A choice, a wound too deep for words. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a weathered tin. Inside were folded bits of paper, pencil stubs, and 1 small block of charcoal. He wrote slowly, pressing hard to make the marks legible. Then turned the paper around. It said, "Words cost me more than they give. But I hear you." She stared at the message, tears burning. No one had heard her in weeks, maybe months. Her father hadn't. The townsfolk hadn't. But this silent man with calloused hands and fire-warmed eyes, he had. She folded the note and tucked it into her skirt pocket like a secret, like something sacred. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't afraid of the mountain anymore. The mountain had a way of holding silence like breath, especially after a snowfall. Clara had begun to find peace in that stillness, waking to the scent of pine and firewood, moving through the day with simple tasks that made her feel steady. The man, whom she now called him in her thoughts, never by name, remained wordless but watchful, his gestures kind, his boundaries gentle. But peace on the mountain never lasted long. That morning, as she stepped outside to shake out the bedding, she froze. Along the edge of the cabin, near the line where the trees thickened, were boot prints. Fresh, too wide to be hers, too shallow to be his, who walked heavier. And there were more than 1 set. Her heart skipped. She turned, but he was already behind her, rifle in hand, eyes alert. He'd seen them too. He motioned her inside with a calm that made her legs obey. From the window, they watched. An hour passed, then 2. Nothing moved in the trees, but the cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were listening. He lit no lamps that night. Instead, they ate cold stew by the fireplace and kept the windows shuttered. She tried to sleep, but the sound of the wind whistling over the chimney kept morphing into imagined voices. Somewhere past midnight, he moved to the window again, then disappeared into the night without a word. She rose, heart pounding, pressed her face to the glass. A small signal fire burned briefly in the distance, then vanished. A message. For whom? She waited with her hands clenched around the edge of her blanket until he returned. Hours later, snow crusted to his shoulders, jaw set hard. He placed a tattered leather pouch on the table and unrolled it. Inside were 5 silver coins and a broken locket. She knew them instantly. They had belonged to Sarah Walker, the midwife's daughter, gone missing 3 months back. Clara's breath caught. Her father had claimed Sarah ran off with a drifter. But here, in the quiet of the mountain, the truth pressed in cold and slow. These men weren't strangers. They were hunters. Not for game. For girls. She looked up at the man, and for the first time, fear rose between them. Not of him, but of what was coming. He reached out, placed the locket into her hand, then gently closed her fingers around it. His message was clear. This wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a line drawn. A promise. If they came this far to take her back, they wouldn't return whole. They arrived just after dawn on the 5th day. 3 riders on lathered horses, their shadows stretching long against the snow as they crested the ridge above the cabin. Clara saw them first through the window, her breath catching as the lead man dismounted, rifle in hand, the others following close. No badges, no banners, just hunger in their eyes, and the kind of silence that didn't come from kindness. She stepped back from the glass, heart pounding, and turned. But the mountain man was already at the door, loading a second rifle, his face a wall of stone. He handed her a bundle, jerky, flint, a small knife, and motioned to the back. The meaning was clear. Go to the old trail, wait for my signal. But she didn't move. If they're here for me, I'm not hiding, she whispered, voice thin. He looked at her then, truly looked, like he was trying to memorize something he couldn't explain. Then he nodded, once, slow. When the knock came, it wasn't timid. The lead man, thin, pale-eyed, snake-grinned, spoke loud enough for them both to hear through the door. We're here on sheriff's orders. Girl went missing. Word is she's up here with you. Clara stepped forward, but the mountain man raised a hand. Wait. Snake Grin continued. We ain't looking for trouble, but the law says she's to come back. You can either hand her over or bury her yourself when the spring thaw comes. The mountain man opened the door, just a crack, just enough to show the barrel of the rifle. No words, just steel. Snake Grin laughed, slow and cruel. Didn't take you for the type to protect damaged goods, old man. That was when the gunshot rang out, not from the cabin, but from the ridge. The mountain man yanked Clara down as splinters exploded from the doorframe. She scrambled behind the table as he returned fire, the crack of his rifle sharp and final. One rider fell, the others scattered, hooves thundering through snow, gunfire echoing off the pines, and then silence. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The mountain man stood over her, hand on her shoulder, eyes scanning the tree line. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The smoke rising from the rifle was enough. He had drawn blood for her, chosen her over whatever deal her father had made. As the sun rose over the mountain and melted the ice from the porch rail, Clara felt something inside her shift. Not just safety, not just survival, something sacred. He had protected her like she was worth something. And in the echo of violence, that truth felt louder than the gunfire. The cabin smelled of powder and pine, smoke still curling from the muzzle of the mountain man's rifle as he stood just beyond the threshold, eyes sweeping the tree line with slow calculation. Clara stayed low behind the table, her breath catching each time the wind shifted, half expecting another shot. But none came. The two surviving men had fled. She could feel it more than know it. The mountain seemed to exhale, heavy and cold. He stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and slid the latch across. Not because it would stop anyone, but because the gesture itself felt like armor. Clara rose shakily and stared at the blood on his coat. Not his, but the first rider's. She expected him to say something, anything, even write a word. But he didn't. He just looked at her, and the lines on his face carved deeper with something like sorrow. She sat at the table, numb, trying to find her pulse again. "They'll be back," she whispered, "with more men. They always come back." He nodded slowly, then crossed the room to the hearth, knelt, and stirred the fire with the iron poker. She watched him pull a small tin from behind the stove. Gunpowder, herbs, and something she couldn't name. He poured the mixture into a cloth pouch, then another. 6 in total. Not just planning for a defense, preparing for a siege. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You don't even know me." He paused, then reached for his charcoal and paper. When he turned it toward her, her breath hitched. "Because someone once left my sister on a doorstep, too." The words hit harder than any gunshot. Clara looked away, the weight of it thick in her chest. He moved beside her then, sat across the table and lit a stub of candle. With slow hands, he unfolded another scrap of paper. Blank. Then he gestured for her to take the charcoal. She stared at him, confused. "What is this?" He tapped his chest, then hers, then pointed to the page. "Your name," he was saying. "Write it." Her throat tightened. She hadn't written it since her father had cast her out. No letters, no journals, no record. She wasn't even sure it felt like hers anymore. But she picked up the charcoal and pressed it to paper. Clara May Dalton. He took the paper, held it in both hands like something fragile, then set it near the fire. But not in it. He pinned it on the wall, just above the mantel, just below the rifle rack. A place of honor. In that moment, she realized something. She wasn't just being protected. She was being remembered. And in a world where girls were so easily erased, that felt like the rarest kind of salvation. The snow deepened by the day, swallowing the world beyond their clearing until the trees seemed to draw in close like watchmen. For nearly a week, no more riders came. No prints disturbed the white crust beyond the ridge. But the silence no longer felt like fear. It felt like breath held between two hearts, learning how to beat in rhythm. Inside the cabin, their world shrank into something sacred. Clara cooked while he carved. She mended while he loaded bullets. In the evenings, he read old, faded books aloud. Not with voice, but with his hands, tracing each line with slow fingers, as if remembering stories he'd once spoken. She began speaking more, not just out loud, but toward him, trusting he heard every word even if he never replied. She told him about her mother, gone in childbirth, about her father, who believed order was more important than love, about the boy who had loved her in secret and left her in silence. He listened the way no one else ever had, not just with ears, but with stillness. Then, one morning, she woke with fever in her bones and fire in her skin. Her vision blurred, her hands shook, and the cold that crept through her spine made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. He found her half collapsed near the firewood pile, trying to be strong. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms, her quilt slipping to the floor, and laid her on the cot. The moment his hand touched her forehead, her fear melted. He moved with practiced gentleness, laying cold cloths on her skin, draping furs over her legs, mixing herbs into a warm broth he helped her sip spoon by spoon. For 3 days she drifted in and out, and each time her eyes fluttered open, he was there, seated close, watching the rise and fall of her breath like it mattered more than the storm outside. On the 3rd night, when her fever broke and her skin cooled, she blinked into the golden flicker of firelight and found him closer than ever. He reached out with one calloused hand, hesitated, then let his fingers brush the side of her cheek. Just once, just enough. His thumb traced the arc of her cheekbone, so lightly it might have been memory. And for the first time, since the day she'd been cast out, she cried. Not from pain, not from fear, but because someone had touched her like she was made of glass and grace, not sin and shame. She placed her hand gently over his, eyes closed, and whispered, "Don't stop." He didn't. Not until dawn broke, and with it, the knowledge that she wasn't alone on the mountain anymore. The thaw came early that year, the sun breaking through the trees with a warmth that felt almost cruel after so many weeks of fragile peace. Clara woke to bird song instead of wind, and for the first time in months, she stepped outside without a blanket around her shoulders. But the warmth didn't bring comfort. It brought exposure. The snow that had shielded them now revealed every footprint, every hidden path, every trail back down the mountain. And it didn't take long for trouble to find it. He spotted the smoke first, thin, dark, curling from the trees like a warning. She stood beside him on the ridge as they watched it rise, far enough not to choke them, close enough to mean something. A second camp. A signal. Someone was watching. He packed fast, not in panic, but with purpose. Extra ammunition, dried meat, his map inked with old escape routes. He handed her a small knife and wrote a note she read twice over. "They're waiting to follow us. We go where they can't." She didn't ask where that was. She just nodded. They moved before dusk, slipping through birch trees and across frozen creeks, their breath ghosting in the fading light. He led without sound, and she followed with trust stitched into every step. By midnight, they reached a rocky pass that climbed into sheer stone. She paused, staring up at the narrow trail. "No horse can follow through there," she whispered. He nodded. That was the point. At the top of the pass, they found a fire pit, long unused, and a crumbled lean-to. He rebuilt it with fast hands while she gathered what little kindling hadn't been soaked by the thaw. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That night they sat close beneath the stars, and she asked the question that had been living in her chest since the fever broke. "Do you want me to leave when this ends?" He turned toward her, brow furrowing like she'd spoken something backward. Then he reached for his paper and wrote slowly, "You were never mine to keep, but I will never send you away." She read it once, twice. Then she leaned in and placed her forehead to his. Her tears slid down between them, and still he didn't move. Until he did, pressing his lips to her temple in a kiss so reverent, it felt like prayer. Below them, the smoke from the second camp faded into night, but she knew in her bones this wasn't over. The men would come. Her father might come, but so would spring. And she was no longer a girl being punished. She was a woman worth protecting. The hoofbeats came at dawn, steady and unhurried, like a man certain he had the upper hand. Clara heard them first, and something inside her curled tight. She didn't need to see the shape of the rider to know. She knew that gait, that weight. Her father had come himself. From the rise above their shelter, she and the mountain man watched the lone rider enter the clearing below. He wore his badge like a blade and dismounted slowly, hands in full view. "Clara May," he called, voice echoing too calm across the rocks. "I came to bring you home." She stiffened, her feet already cold against the stone. The mountain man didn't move. He simply laid his rifle across his knees and watched. Her father continued, "You've made your point, girl, but this has gone too far. You're carrying shame that belongs in private, not out here with savages and ghosts." Her heart thudded. She stepped forward. "You gave me away," she said loud enough to carry. "You traded me for silence." His face twitched, but he kept his voice smooth. "You were out of control. I did what I had to." "You didn't even ask if I was scared," she said. "You never asked what he did to me. You just hid the mess." He moved closer to the fire pit below, glancing at the shadows on the ridge. "That man's dangerous," he warned. "He killed a lawman." Behind her, the mountain man slowly stood. Not threatening, not hiding, just standing. Visible. Present. The sheriff looked up at him, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but uncertainty. "You gonna let her throw away her life for what? Pity?" Clara stepped between them. "He hasn't said a word in weeks, and he's listened to more of me than you ever did." The silence between father and daughter stretched long, brittle as thawing ice. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his coat. Not fast, not overt, but she saw it. The mountain man didn't raise his rifle. Instead, he stepped beside Clara and laid a single hand on her back. Steady. Solid. Then he reached into his pocket and held up the letter. The one her father had written weeks ago, now water-stained and torn. He tossed it down the ridge. It landed at the sheriff's feet like a broken badge. Her father stared at it, jaw clenched, then turned without another word. He mounted his horse, reined it hard, and disappeared down the trail. No threat, no apology, just a man too small for the mountain. And Clara, still standing in the morning sun, felt something inside her snap loose. Not anger, not grief, just freedom, clean as the wind. Spring settled over the mountain like a benediction. Snow melted into the creeks, wildflowers breached the thawed earth, and the sharp edge of survival softened into something warmer, slower, almost tender. The threat was gone. No riders came. No more smoke on the horizon, just birdsong, firewood, and the steady rhythm of two people learning how to exist together, without fear. Clara spent her mornings planting herbs along the cabin's edge, her belly now showing more plainly beneath the wool she wore. He built her a bench in the sun, carved it by hand from pine smoothed by wind, and placed it where the light touched longest in the afternoon. She watched him every day, watched how he never rushed, how he moved with care even when no one was looking. He still hadn't spoken. Not once. But she had learned to read him like a language without words. The way he tilted his head when she was tired, how he placed an extra spoonful in her bowl without comment, how he lingered when her hands brushed his. One evening, just as the sun began to set fire to the treetops, he motioned for her to follow him behind the cabin. There, tucked between two aspens, was a new door frame, unfinished but sturdy. A second cabin. For the baby. For her. Her throat tightened as she stepped inside, the scent of fresh-cut wood wrapping around her like safety. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you want me here, even after the baby?" He didn't write anything this time. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the far wall, where something had already been carved deep into the wood grain. She traced it with trembling fingers. 2 names, Clara May, and below it, Elan. She turned slowly, eyes wide. "Elan?" she whispered. He nodded, gently tapping his chest, then her chest, then the wall again, his name, and hers, carved together, not spoken, promised. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She leaned into his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, not like a man claiming what was his, but like someone holding something too precious to break. The mountain had given her no fairy tale, no sudden magic. Just this, quiet safety, slow healing, and a man who held her not like a punishment, but like something sacred. And as dusk gathered, the first wolf howled in the distance, not a warning, a witness. And in that sound, Clara knew she had finally been chosen, not cast out, not bartered, chosen. On a mountain where no one had expected her to survive, she had built a name, a future, a home.